are the victims, hard-working people who have lost their homes.
We're homeless. So we don't know exactly where they're going to go.
Or who are about to lose their homes after living in them for over 30 years.
My husband and I are very sick over this, and we haven't been able to sleep or function properly.
It's a story about greed, deceit, and very rich people trying to get richer. CEO! And activists who resort to controversial tactics to fight back.
Nonviolent bank terrorism.
And those responsible for the catastrophe.
Our mortgage fraud caseload has doubled in the past 3 years to more than 1,400 pending investigations.
Don't be fooled by the bland economic descriptions, the credit crisis, or the subprime mortgage fiasco. The truth is, this might be one of the biggest financial scandals in modern history, and it's not just creating economic panic, it's done something more frightening. Like the Wizard of Oz, it's pulled back the veil on a global financial system that is so deregulated, it might be spinning out of control and impossible to fix. It's so serious that major American banks and investment houses have failed, while mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have actually been bailed out and taken over by the US government. And it may be getting even worse. This could be called the Great Wall Street Swindle. To truly understand the heart of this swindle, you must begin with ordinary people like the Pierre Canals.
We bought this house in November of 2004.
The house is located in Boston. The Pierre Canals were offered what sounded to them like a very attractive subprime mortgage. It had low interest rates for the first couple of years, but there was a catch. The interest rates would suddenly jump.
The person who sold us the loan told us that, we could easily refinance because our houses were going to appraise.
That promise never came true. Unable to afford the increasing interest payments, and unable to renegotiate their loan, they lost the house earlier this summer. You could be evicted at any time.
Anytime.
And you have 3 kids. Do your kids know any about this now?
They don't know. I mean, I think it will be shocking to them also when we live here because they know where their home is. Yeah. So they know their house number, and whenever they go in the neighborhood, they say, well, okay, this is where our home is. Now, it will be a shock to them wherever we go.
If you want to know the real story about what's happening to our economy, you have to come here, outside the New York Stock Exchange, home to the world's great financial institutions. This is a story about how globalization and deregulation allowed a huge speculative investment bubble to be built, which wildly overvalued certain investments and ended up burning individuals like you and I. But in an effort to sustain the lucrative profits from fees that the financial industry earned from this bubble, much of it now stands accused of fraud. And if you think the Canadian economy is immune to all this, think again. Someone who saw this crisis coming is George Soros, world famous as an investment guru. He met us in his offices in Manhattan and told us we're in the midst of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. What makes this so desperately bad?
It is more serious than the crises we have had in the last 25 years. We have had a number of financial crises. They're all part of what I call a super bubble.
Soros believes that we're now seeing the result of decades of deregulation, with the financial community now having trillions of dollars of potentially toxic investment ready to explode.
This belief that markets are best left to their own devices is a false belief. And therefore, left to their own devices, markets created crises.
This sort of casino of speculation in search of great profits was not always the case. So why is this crisis suddenly upon us? Well, once upon a time, after the Great Depression, banks and brokerages were forced to put aside reserves when they issued mortgages or when they made loans. All that started to change in the 1980s. Now, when banks sell a mortgage, they take that debt and they give it to Wall Street's investment houses, where it's pooled together with many other mortgages into large funds. Then Wall Street sells stocks in these huge funds to investors. The question is, why do investors buy them? Because mortgages are seen as safe and secure. What's safer than investing in real estate? These became known as mortgage-backed securities.
The banks and mortgage brokers become, in the jargon of the trade, just originators. They're not the holders of these things anymore. And their incentive is to package them as quickly as possible and get them out the door as quickly as possible and let somebody else hold the risk.
Soon, trillions of dollars went pouring into these mortgage-backed investments. It was as hot as the dot-coms once were. Mike Francis was once a top executive in the mortgage division of one of Wall Street's biggest brokerage firms. His job was to sell investors on the growing market of mortgage-backed securities.
There was a lot of money, and there was a much easier access to that money when Wall Street got involved.
All of this worked well for a while. People were buying houses in the millions, which is a good thing. Investors were getting rich from all the mortgage-backed securities they'd bought from Wall Street. But then a problem arose. As Wall Street's appetite for mortgage-backed securities grew, they needed more Americans to buy more houses. But by about 2004, the market was running dry of people who had the means to buy a house.
You got this huge demand out there by these investors. But the investment bankers had a problem. They needed to get homeowners to get mortgages.
Let's make ourselves loud, let's make ourselves comfortable.
Bruce Marks, self-described as a bank terrorist, is the president of the Neighborhood Association Corporation of America, which has fought Wall Street's predatory mortgage practices.
So what did? They created products that sounded so good, that were so enticing, that they basically sucked in millions and millions of homeowners to really accept and to sign on to those products, because they had to meet the insatiable demand of the investment bankers and of the investors out there.
Having run out of solvent potential homeowners, the mortgage industry simply began selling their infamous subprime mortgages. These had so-called teaser rates, that's low interest rates that would then jump after a couple of years. They were often called ninja loans, which stood for no income, no job, meaning they were sold to people who didn't even need to provide a down payment or evidence that they were actually employed. That is a huge market.
It's a deception Ponzi scheme that's out there because these mortgages were structured to fail. You know, there was no way that this was not going to happen.
In fact, Charles Morris, a former banker, agrees that the system was rigged so that mortgage brokers received an incentive to convince homeowners to take mortgages that the homeowners couldn't even afford.
So the mortgage brokers were being paid to make sure that people got into mortgages that cost more and were unsafe.
And among the victims were Paul and Linda Capriotti, who live in a working-class suburb of Boston. They bought their home back in 1979 and they had it paid off 10 years later. But soon, the bubble swallowed them as well.
We remortgaged to do a second level on the house for the children because we only had the 2 bedrooms.
So this is it. After remortgaging, they received a call in 2004 from a broker who offered to replace their mortgage with one with a lower rate. One day you got a phone call in 2004. When you got that call, were you offered a predatory loan?
No, we were offered a low interest loan. And it ended up a predatory loan.
You didn't know it at the time?
No, we didn't.
No, because when we sign the papers, nobody says a word about any balloon note.
In fact, the broker sold them a new mortgage that actually had hidden huge rate increases.
We had an adjustable rate, and she said, before the adjustable, goes higher, we'll remortgage you. When I called her in June, which was a year and a half after the loan, she said she was going bankrupt, she was going out of business.
Today, mired in debt and saddled with huge interest payments, the Capriottis are about to lose their home.
It's my dream kitchen that I've wanted my whole life.
In a letter she wrote to the Massachusetts government, Linda said,
"My husband and I are very sick over this, and we haven't been able to sleep or function properly. Please help us. Thank you."
All told, between 3 and 4 million Americans will lose their homes as a result of the subprime mortgage fiasco, and over $2 trillion of toxic debt will remain unpaid. So what happened to the financial institutions who created this whole house of cards? The story of Bear Stearns, once one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms, is an example. As families like the Capriottis began defaulting on their mortgages, all those huge pools of funds filled with mortgages that Bear Stearns and other companies were peddling began to go bad. Like so much of Wall Street, Bear Stearns' response to the crisis was anything but transparent and accountable. Ralph Cioffi was the Bear Stearns manager for their 2 huge mortgage-backed securities hedge funds.
He was a very autocratic individual. He was a very aggressive individual.
Stephen Caruso is a New York-based lawyer who represents someone suing Bear Stearns for fraud. He's familiar with Cioffi's methods.
It's very similar to a pyramid scheme. You keep leveraging the portfolio, and of course he was getting paid based on the value of the portfolio. When the market moved against him, it didn't take very long for all of these securities to be totally wiped out.
As early as 2007, Cioffi knew his Bear Stearns hedge funds would implode. Internal emails from his computer say, subprime losses will be far worse than anything people have modeled, and that his hedge funds might melt down. But such misgivings and fears were not passed on to investors. Quite the opposite. Cioffi tried to keep selling. In this exclusive recording obtained by CBC, this is what Cioffi told investors during a conference call in the spring of 2007.
We have a plan in place that will get the funds back on track to generate positive return. And most importantly, we have financing and we have significant amounts of liquidity.
It's very similar to what Enron was doing. I don't want to say it's cooking the books, but it's certainly grilling the books.
By the summer of 2007, Bear Stearns' 2 hedge funds, filled with subprime mortgage debt, collapsed. And this winter, Bear Stearns as a whole was dragged under too.
Bear Stearns, the 5th largest investment bank in the country, had to be rescued from collapse.
And this past June, Cioffi was arrested for fraud for misleading investors. If the story of Bear Stearns and subprime mortgages illustrates how few are watching over the financial system in the United States, guess what? Canada is in a similar boat. When we come back, how the subprime mortgage crisis rolled into Canada and left investors here with billions in losses amidst allegations of fraud against Bay Street and Canada's banking community.
There was many days I thought that I would lose everything, and I would cry. It was devastating because you've worked so hard. I'm sorry.
Last year, like a tidal wave, the American subprime mortgage crisis crashed into Canada. And in doing so, it triggered our own financial industry meltdown that exposed just how out of control our investment community might also be.
They took away my power of my own money.
What happened to Iris Pierce is that $130,000 of her own money was invested in an obscure financial product called asset-backed commercial paper, or as they call it in the financial world, ABCP. Asset-backed commercial paper is an investment structure that's based on things like commercial and housing mortgages that are bundled together and then sold mostly by big banks. It was given a AAA rating by Canada's only credit rating agency, DBRS, which meant it was supposed to be very safe. When the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis crashed into the global markets in the summer of 2007, $32 billion of Canadian investors' money tied up in ABCP suddenly became suspect.
In August, people started asking questions about subprime mortgages, and they started saying, what's in this AAA paper? Do I have any subprime mortgage exposure?
Daryl Ching was an investment banker who worked for a small Toronto-based investment company that sold ABCP.
It was chaos and fear that caused a mass exodus in the market.
Indeed, investors like Iris Pierce saw their money frozen and inaccessible to them. This wasn't supposed to happen. ABCP was sold by Canada's financial industry to prominent companies like Barrick Gold, Toronto Hydro, and Magna International as a very safe AAA-rated investment, as safe as government bonds. This email from one broker to a client even suggested that ABCP was safer than guaranteed investment certificates, or GICs.
I did believe my broker.
ABCP was also sold to 1,800 small investors, mostly senior citizens and retirees like Iris Pierce, the former salesperson who, at 61 years old, lives in St. Catharines, Ontario. She recalls her conversation with her broker.
When I went to see her and it sold, I said, I'm going to go GICs. I said, I want it somewhere safe. I don't want mutual funds. I don't know. She said, oh, I've got something better than that. It's AAA rated. No problem. If this goes down, the whole banking system's going to go down.
Clearly, none of this was true because we had a $32 billion market freeze.
Diane Urquhart spent 25 years working for Bay Street brokerage houses as a research analyst.
There was no question that asset-backed commercial paper was a dangerous security. It was flawed in its design.
So, what was the big flaw? Canadian investors were told that asset-backed commercial paper was actually guaranteed by our big banks, as if there was some kind of insurance policy if anything went wrong. The truth is, that wasn't the case at all.
The risky element was that it was sold on the basis of a bank guarantee, but the fine print of the bank guarantee in the contracts was such that it was not a guarantee. And so the Canadian public was negligently and possibly fraudulently misinformed about the bank guarantee.
In fact, it was well known among Canada's banking community that this guarantee was weak. After all, even the respected American credit rating agencies Moody's and Standard & Poor's would not touch the stuff, refusing to even rate ABCP in Canada because they believed the bank guarantee was so faulty. In this 2002 report by Standards, they called the guarantee meaningless. Only Canada's own credit rating agencies, DBRS, gave it the AAA rating. The obscure flaw in the bank guarantee became a crucial issue in the summer of 2007 with the U.S. subprime mortgage fiasco. Canadian investors suddenly realized that some of their ABCP was actually invested in American subprime mortgages. They had never been told.
The only people that had the information were the rating agencies, the investment banks that created these structures.
In fact, Canada's financial industry knew the subprime mortgage credit crisis might pose a threat to part of Canada's ABCP market, yet they decided not to tell investors. On July 24th of 2007, one of the financial companies selling ABCP, called Coventry, actually wrote a memo that was then sent on to the big banks detailing just how much subprime mortgage exposure existed. The big banks then met to discuss the memo.
Meetings took place regarding the significance of the July 24th memorandum, and discussions took place about whether a media release was required to inform the Canadian investing public. It was decided not to do so.
In one subsequent lawsuit, the Bank of Nova Scotia's brokerage house, Scotia Capital, is even accused of dumping their ABCP into the market to get it off their books after the Coventry memo was issued. The lawsuit says that Scotia Capital began to reduce, limit, or eliminate its ABCP inventory because of their exposure to subprime mortgages.
It would be like selling a can of tainted tuna. You know that the tuna is bad, you know that the security has an impairment in its value, but you continue to sell it.
Scotia Capital denies the dumping allegation. By August of 2007, the jig was up. Investors stopped buying ABCP because of fears of subprime exposure, and suddenly $32 billion was locked up. And what happened to the supposed bank guarantee to rescue investors? Well, most of the big banks, except for the Bank of Nova Scotia, refused to honor it. Instead, investors, corporate and senior citizens alike, couldn't access their own money.
They've taken away my power that I can't go and buy new windows for the house. If I want to go on vacation, they've taken away my power to do what I want to do with my money.
Iris Pierce is now in such financial peril, she's considering ending her retirement and returning to the workforce.
There was many days I thought that I would lose everything. And I would cry. It was devastating because you've worked so hard. I'm sorry. And right now, as I say, I still don't know where it's going.
With the market frozen, Canada's financial industry hired corporate lawyer Purdy Crawford to sort out the mess. His task was to get $32 billion of investors' money back to them somehow. However, when he went on the road to peddle a plan to investors, he offered them notes that would mature in 9 years instead of getting their money back immediately. Investors were, not surprisingly, outraged.
I am here because I want my money. I don't want coupons.
I had to go back to work at 65 years old. So I'm mad. It's not your fault, but hey, give it back.
Such was the outcry that a deal was then struck whereby small investors would get their money back, but companies and corporations would get the 9-year note. Moreover, they could not sue the banks, the dealers, and the investment companies who sold them ABCP in the first place for misleading them about the safety of the investment. All told, if they cashed in the notes today, as much as $16 billion of the $32 billion in Canadian investors' money would be lost. And small mining companies like Toronto-based Norsemount, who had $7 million tied up in ABCP, are looking at serious consequences.
This amounts to the expropriation of private property rights.
Patrick Evans is the CEO of Norsemount Mining.
And this establishes a very, very serious precedent. What they have essentially allowed, they've opened the door for financial institutions in Canada to expropriate, to take away the savings of and investments of Canadian citizens with impunity. This establishes a precedent that Canadians will live to regret for decades.
None of the big banks or financial institutions would talk to the CBC about the asset-backed commercial paper fiasco, but this isn't the only example of how the American subprime mortgage crisis has rolled into Canada to devastating effect. Debt-laden and burdened with huge mortgage payments, American consumers can no longer afford to buy Canadian-made exports like cars or consumer goods. And this goes a long way to explaining why Canada has lost 90,000 manufacturing jobs this year alone. Trish and Jim McAuliffe work at General Motors in Oshawa, Ontario. They're slated to lose their jobs next year when GM closes a truck plant.
If we lose these jobs, we don't feel like we would be able to find another job that pays as well.
The plant closure will lead to 1,200 layoffs in GM in Oshawa alone.
Every job loss that comes out of our facility affects 78 jobs in the community. And I mean, that trickles, that's our suppliers, people in the retail industry, right down to the person serving Tim Hortons coffee.
So, what is the result of all this scandal? When billions of dollars and the most prestigious banks and investment houses can spin so badly out of control, the answer for billionaire investors like George Soros is not more free markets, but regulation.
You don't necessarily need more regulation, you need better regulation.
But until there's better regulation, and that's still a long time coming, Soros predicts a dire future.
I think the outlook is significantly worse than it is currently admitted.
It's worse than we think.
I think we are in a difficult period, and it's going to get, I'm afraid it's going to be more serious than currently the authorities lead us to believe.